Hi, this is Jim Colton, and this is the Driven Golf Podcast. This episode is a compilation of all the angle of attack segments from episode 2 to 9. Over the course of these episodes, golf coach Andrew Lewis and I cover the whole spectrum, from getting your junior golfer started in tournament golf to how to best prepare leading up to an event. Even if you aren't a junior golfer or parent of one, I truly believe there's something there for everyone to help in your golf journey. And if you know of a parent of a competitive player, this would be the perfect episode to send their way. If you are in the junior tournament circuit and have been listening, then you already know the importance of having a yardage book for tournament success. Andrew and I truly believe StrackaLine yardage books are best in class, and they have graciously offered 20% off all yardage book orders to Driven Golf Podcast listeners. Just go to StrackaLine.com and enter promo code DRIVEN at checkout. With that, here's episode 10, The Angle of Attack with Andrew Lewis Compilation, Volume 1. So one of the things I wanted to talk about is just sort of the evolution of a junior golfer. In the first episode, we talked about just introducing junior golfers to the game, some of the tips, some of the advice for parents, and some of the lessons learned, frankly, from our mistakes in the past. But what about that step when you got a young golfer playing golf, he's getting his way around, he's getting the ball in the hole, and you're starting to see some progress? Like, when do you know it's the right time to jump into tournament golf and competitive golf?
Yeah, this is a tricky question because on the one hand, if you sign up your kid to play soccer at age 3, basically within a week, they're playing a game. And they're on a team, though, so they don't have to have tons of skills. They don't have to be able to score a goal or be goalie. They basically just have to be able to run around. And that's how most sports are. If you sign up for basketball or baseball, to a degree, you can almost hide. But they are getting game experience. So the alternative is not true that you need to wait until your kid is proficient at every skill that you're going to encounter when you play a round of golf. The first time that my son played a tournament, he was 9, and he shot a 59 on 9 holes. And I really didn't know what he was going to shoot because we hadn't played a lot of 9-hole rounds. Within 3 months, he was shooting in the 30s. And I bring that up because the number one motivator for him was seeing that he was in last place by a mile. I mean, 59 is 23 over. I remember I stroked him in the bunker for grounding his club, by the way. So not a great, he didn't know the rules. So I would say when your kid can hit the ball in the air, he has some level of speed control on the greens, he can hit a basic chip shot. That's about all someone would need to go and play a competitive round of golf. You do not need to worry about if they go and finish last. You don't need to worry if they make a 9. They are going to do all of that. You're going to play against some kids who have been playing for years because they started age 4 or 5, which might be a little bit on the early side. But you don't need to wait. I would say most parents wait too long because they're trying to wait until their kid is good enough. But there is never going to be a good enough because there's always going to be someone that's a little bit better than your kid, most likely, until they're the number one player in the world. So if you can take them out for 9 holes and they seem to have enough skill just to complete most of the holes, that's good enough.
Yeah, and a lot of these, we're just talking local 9-hole events.
Yes,
they'll have a limit on score. The rules are set up such that it doesn't get too frustrating. I do think you're right. I mean, that the first time it's going to be a shock to the system. So set your expectations accordingly.
And remember that having the best 9-year-old in the world doesn't matter. No one knows who the best. Do you know, Jim? Do you know who the best 9-year-old in the world is right now?
I have no idea.
No idea. So just breathe, relax, go get some ice cream. It'll be okay.
The only thing that I would add to that, you just touched base on it, is there are always going to be kids better than your kid, right? I think if you're dominating the local scene and you're 7 years old, my son, he never played in any of these U.S. Kids events, like the IMG Junior Worlds or one of these big national events. I never felt that he needed to do it. And there's nothing wrong with that. But you shouldn't feel like you have to do this for your kid's development. Like you said, no one's going to remember that, if the kid's basically winning a trophy that's bigger than him, it might be a little excessive. But I think they do want to win ribbons or whatever. But like my strategy was like when Luke was pretty good and beating kids his age, he played the local kids, but that were 1 or 2 years older, right? Those kids are going to be bigger. They would have been doing it longer. And, he was losing to them at first, and then he figured out a way to beat them. I think one of the biggest advantages of being one of the smaller golfers is like, yeah, every stage of golf, for the most part, there's going to be somebody that's out driving you by 40 yards, or even on a hole, even if you're kind of with that guy, like there may be times you don't hit it quite as well, or you hit in the rough and you're 40 yards behind the other guy. Like maybe it's match play, right? And you got to figure out a way to beat that guy from 40 yards behind. That's an acquired and developed skill.
For sure.
So I always felt like we didn't really have a need to travel too far. There were kids that could give my son a run for the money, a couple years older in our town. And I remember like we would look up to those kids like, oh, that kid is unbeatable.
Yeah.
He's winning everything at these little local events. And you just keep chipping away at it. Yeah. And eventually like you're the guy, and then you just move on to the next stage. So I would say if you're winning everything, you're probably not doing it right. Like you should seek out competition. Like you should seek out guys or maybe 1 or 2 steps ahead of you in order to meet, and get that continued development.
Yeah. Something I'd add is I frequently seem like when I'm doing like year-end goal sessions or something like that I'm having to talk to kids about gaining competitive experience. Like they just haven't played enough tournaments. Because playing competitive golf is a skill, like learning how you perform under pressure, all of your processing skills, your golf IQ, like all that stuff it frankly takes like hundreds of reps. If I had to guess, I would say Cameron's played probably 200 tournaments to date. He's 14. So there's no substitute. Even if the kid goes and plays terrible, he's still gaining some experience of what it feels like to tee off and you can't, hold the club because you're so nervous, or your heart rate's really high, or you make a 9 and you're like having to move on from that. All of those things are going to happen, and you might as well let them happen because you need to learn to deal with it. Because, oh, by the way, as you play golf, all that stuff's going to continue to happen, even at the highest levels. So gaining the experience is huge.
Yeah. I remember the first year Luke started playing in 36-hole events here and the Legends events that you mentioned last time, in his age group. In the first tournament, first round, he shot an 88. And, he'd been shooting par or close to par, a few over par for most of the time. And it was a bit of that shell shock that I mentioned earlier. But, we had sort of that moment of was this the right decision? Did we do the right thing? And you just got to go through those experiences. And, a couple months later, he's back to shooting his normal scores. And that summer, he was extremely competitive in those events. So it's just, and look, like a lot of times, especially in those early ages, like you don't really need to focus on the rankings, right? And we'll talk about rankings at some later date. But those things are going to roll off and nobody's going to care about it 12 months later. It'll leave a little bit of a mark early on, but it's pretty much meaningless as they go through their development.
Yeah, I hope that's the case. I hope Cameron's 59 doesn't hold him back moving forward.
Exactly.
At least he's in the 59 club.
What I wanted to talk a little bit about this episode is probably when you're starting to see golfers for the first time. They're probably in that age 11, 12, 13 range, possibly younger. I imagine many of those athletes are playing multiple sports, and really wanted to get your perspective on the pros and cons around being a multi-sport athlete, and then also like guidance and input in terms of when do you make that transition to specialize in one sport or another. So obviously you've seen a lot of junior golfers, different stages of their development, some maybe solo golf. We could talk about some of the pros and cons of that. But then also eventually if they keep progressing in the game, like what time is the right time to really focus your time and effort in golf?
Yeah, I would start with there is no exact blueprint that someone has shown, right? There are good players that have never played any sport besides golf. And then there are stud athletes who chose golf very, very late that were very successful. So I'm going to preface with that. The trend that I'm seeing is that kids are starting earlier and earlier to specialize. I'm talking 9, 10 years old where they are not playing other sports. And there's something inside of me that doesn't love that, because to me it screams that someone is wanting their kid to be like the best 11, 12, or 13-year-old on the planet, which I don't think really matters. It's great to learn to win at that age, but I just don't necessarily see that translating when they're 15, 16, 17. So does that mean that your kid shouldn't be playing competitive golf at those ages? Absolutely not. Of course they should. It's great to get the competitive experience like we talked about. But having your kid decide to choose this sport later because they're playing basketball, baseball, football, or other sports, lacrosse, serves a lot of benefit because of the athleticism that you're creating in that kid that you're just going to flat out lose. You're going to lose it so much that many of the developmental golf classes that I see literally have stations trying to get these kids to do athletic moves because it is so important. TPI has done so much research that you're trying to build an athlete. You're not necessarily trying to build a golfer. Now, the benefit of specializing early is that golf is just about the most specialized sport, that and something like hockey, to where there are a lot of skills that require years and years of development, like speed control on the greens, vision around the greens, not things like ball striking so much, not things like speed. Those things are going to come at later ages are fine. So that's why you do see these kids that specialize early are really, really good because they're basically, beating the curve on those skills. But there is nothing to suggest that a kid that starts a little bit later isn't going to catch up in that area. That's all this is. It's just catching up. And what those kids that generally start early are losing is the athleticism, which is probably going to translate mostly to speed. To answer your question of when should someone specialize, I would say for most kids, it's going to be the end of middle school, going into high school, 9th grade. We live in about the most competitive market in the country, North Texas, and that's the model I see. And if you can do that here and be successful, I believe Luke did that. I know my son Cameron did that at the end of 8th grade. That is plenty of time to start devoting like all of your attention to golf, in my opinion.
For those kids that are specialized early, I imagine some of those kids are just golf junkies. Like, and you see that and observe that, and you maybe have a sense of that. Like that was their decision and their motivation. I imagine that you probably see some instances where it's like you said, somebody is more focused on, maybe a parent is more focused on where their kid is relative to other kids and thinking, well, if my kid specializes, he can catch that boy or girl that's ranked number 1 in the world or whatever.
Yeah.
But like in that instance, are you really running the risk of potential burnout? Like, do you see flameouts in your experience where kids that maybe they enjoyed golf at one point, but then it became more of a chore as opposed to a game?
It's not necessarily it becoming a chore. You have to remember that these kids that early specialize, like I said, are good and that they dominate to a degree early on. And so what becomes the burnout phase is that is likely not going to be sustained because as more and more kids are coming into the class that are playing and more of these athletic kids are coming in that hit the ball really, really far, and then they catch up on those skills, it's not that they necessarily burn out. They just don't win or have as much success at the rate that they were earlier. That's not all of them, just saying the ones that don't necessarily progress quite as well, to where it's just not panning out the way that they were thinking. I never see burnout from a kid that loves it. You see burnout more from a kid that likes it, but has a parent that is very, very difficult, where it becomes unsustainable to play because of the roller coaster of emotions from event to event.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I think in terms of the benefits of multi-sport athletes, just from my perspective, as you mentioned, Luke played just about every sport growing up, but really was a pretty, serious baseball player growing up. Like when we first moved to Texas and met with you.
Yeah.
And he played all the way through his summer of 8th grade before high school. And he played basketball all through middle school, all through the younger years. I think the benefit from that, not only from an athleticism standpoint, is that each one of these sports, I think, offers something a little bit different than golf. whether it be the team environment, which golf doesn't really offer, but then a lot of these kids want to play in college, and all of a sudden you're in a team environment, right?
Sure.
Putting your teammates ahead of yourself or helping them in their development, those sorts of things. I think with baseball in particular, my son, for whatever reason, he developed this knack at a very young age where he wanted the ball and he wanted to be on the mound. So I can remember he was the designated closer on these teams. Like, he threw fast, but he wasn't like blowing people away. But he had absolutely no fear to be on the mound and wanted the ball and wanted to be on the mound. So the coaches would just throw him into these crazy situations, like bases loaded, nobody out, 1-run game, and be like, "Hey, Luke, have at it." And there's a lot of kids that would shrink in that environment. And I'm not saying that he succeeded every time. He succeeded quite a bit, right? But just the fact that he wasn't afraid to be in that moment, that I firmly believe that that absolutely has carried over into his golf. The pressure of the moment, being in contention down the stretch, and wanting to be in that position and actually enjoying being in that position, I think has helped him have success in tournament golf. It has to, right?
Yeah.
So I think it's the same as like having a play drawn up and shooting a 3 when the game is on the line, or like getting fouled at the end and having to sink 2 free throws to win the game for your team. Only certain people really want to be in that position. Other people will be glad to pass the ball and let someone else take that last second shot, right? So all of these different sports are teaching things that are a little bit different, that also have some transferability
for sure.
into golf, for sure.
That's what, if you watch any of the press conferences from the Ryder Cup, that's what somebody asked Brooks Koepka. They said, "How many of the guys on the team do you think really want the ball?" And he said, "Very few." Which then Max Homa, after he made that putt on 18, said, "I thought about that all week, and that this is my chance to take the ball," and which he totally just destroyed. But he said, like, that he will take that moment from the Ryder Cup moving forward, to the point like he feels like he'll play better in majors just because of that "I took the ball" moment. So for sure.
Yeah, I heard that podcast. It was an interview with No Laying Up, I believe, like the day after the Ryder Cup. So he was really hot, processing and digesting, everything that happened. The one thing actually I wanted to talk to you about that is, this is sort of off script, but he talked about, someone asked about, like, in the Ryder Cup, can you believe, like, there's only 4 balls on the course at any given, or 4 or 8 balls on the course at any given time. And there's just like hole out chips and just like 40-foot bombs being made left and right. Even like the first hole in the first match, like Hovland chipped in. And I think Homa sort of attributed it to what he called like hyper focus. Yeah. It's like when you're in the moment and you absolutely have to hit this shot, that you have to like dig deep in and tap into this belief, like this self-belief that how to hit this shot, and affirm like self-confidence and self-belief that you have this ability. And I think these elite golfers, for whatever reason, they're able to tap into this like zone, so to speak. And, they're just processing all the information that they need to hit this given shot, and they're able to execute. I just wonder, I was thinking about that this week. And I just wonder if, like, is the reason that Tiger Woods is, perhaps the greatest golfer of all time, is he was able to just tap into that more often than not, right? Because they all have this elite skill level, but they're really, for whatever reason, they're displaying it in this Ryder Cup under that sort of pressured situation, and maybe week in and week out, they're not really able to tap into it as much.
Yeah, my take on that, especially with the Tiger thing, like, I think Tiger's the greatest because of his level of discipline. Like, I don't think it was necessarily because, like, holding stuff out. Obviously, he's hyper focused, but his level of discipline, like, we throughout 72 holes was just like nobody else. I have thought about the hole outs, and I did play in an event and I did chip in, but I had a partner, and I was thinking a lot about this. Like, when you do have a partner, you think about making short game shots and putts a whole lot more, because there really is no consequence in most cases, right? Like, even on 18 with Max, like, Max knew he had to make a 5. Like, if that was to close out a tournament, he would definitely be thinking about making 7 or 8. But in that environment, there is no 7 or 8, doesn't exist. So I would say it's probably more that, where they're literally thinking about making the 50-footer. There is no 3-putt. They're thinking about holding the bunker shot. The one with Victor on hole 1 was insane because an alternate shot, there is more consequence. But at the end of the day, like if you make an 8, you're down a hole. It's not that big of a deal. So I don't know if I agree with Max on all of that. It was funny that I had just played in a 2-man event and I had chipped in and thought about that. But there is something to the hyper focus. But I think there's also like a takeaway of like what you think about, what you like give attention to is likely going to happen. So if I think about making more shots, especially if they're like legit makeable shots, it's probably going to happen more.
Yeah. Yeah. That's interesting. And just getting back to the multiple sport thing, getting yourself in these sorts of moments, right? Regardless of what the sport may be, right? I think you can tap into that when it comes to golf, like this belief that like, hey, I've been in the moment. Yeah. I've succeeded in the moment. I'm not afraid of the moment. Like, let's go attack. Let's get after it. I think that has to help. And maybe that's the main, takeaway is like these sports can all teach different things, about being a good teammate, different movement types, maybe rotating, in different ways. But just like the overall athleticism, the experience of being in these sports and the experience of being on a team and the experience of being in the heat of the moment, I think there is definitely some transferability.
Yeah, I 100% agree.
Hey, I wanted to take a deeper dive on stats, golf stats, tracking stats, using them to help in player development. As you know, it's obviously a subject that I have a great amount of passion and drive towards. I just happen to be pretty analytical in nature. But I just wanted to first of all, get your perspective as a coach of many junior players, many of which maybe they don't have these tools or resources at their disposal. And you're trying to help them develop, obviously, from a technical standpoint. But how do you incorporate stats, or how do you, at a very basic level, someone came to you and you ask them some very basic statistical questions that they're not tracking? Like, how do you get that started? What would you want to look at? And like, how would you start that evolution? And then we can get into the discussion about maybe some of the more advanced tactics.
Yeah. So where I would generally start with someone, especially if they're like newly competitive and not shooting like 72, let's say they're having a hard time breaking 80. With those kind of players, it's very easy to see like where they're probably losing the most strokes. So basic things that I like to know. First off, I don't care who you are. I always want to know what strokes gained putting is. And strokes gained putting is so easy to calculate. All you need to know is distance from the hole and how many putts it took you. The other stats, trying to figure out your tee shot stats, approach shot stats, short game stats. Those could be a little bit more complicated and more complex as far as like what you would want to know. All I would want to know if I was a beginner player is how many fairways did I hit, and did I have a pattern for the ones I missed, which all you have to do would be put an arrow right or left. I like to know on my approach shots, buckets of yardage or windows of yardage. So like 50 to 100 yards, I hit 4 out of 5 greens or 0 out of 5 greens. In scrambling on pitch shots, chip shots, and bunker shots, like what was my up and down percentage? And if I have those things, then I can lean into like this lowest hanging fruit idea where I'm just going to try over the next week or two or at a lesson, fix like my 2 or 3 worst things. Is that going to be easy to track over periods and periods of time? No, but from one event to be able to take that data and start creating some type of training plan, yeah, you could probably do that. Is that super advanced? No. Does that take a little bit of effort? Yeah, not much. But that would be a starting point I would generally recommend if someone's doing like nothing. I would say it's very kindergarten, elementary level statistics.
But I think the important thing is maybe just starting the discipline of thinking about stats and thinking about grouping. Like, I imagine that you probably have conversations or maybe texts from players who are like, oh, I played horrible. And then that's it.
Everyone right? I teach is good.
Right. But then like you're trying to peel back the onion, right? And you're probably having to like pull this information out from them to figure out exactly what went wrong. But I would imagine it'd be a much more efficient conversation of like, I didn't play great today, and this was the culprit, right? I had, like you said, 0 out of 5 greens of regulation from 50 to 100 yards, or whatever the case may be. Like starting that dialogue and having that dialogue between coach and player and speaking in statistical terms can aid in their development, just speed up the process of figuring out what to work on.
It's a weird thing because across the board, even from like some of the professionals all the way down to good high school players, it's just like pulling teeth to get people to get stats. So when you said discipline, I think the thing is like stats aren't even necessarily for the player, right? If you have a coach, you're doing that coach to a degree a disservice when you don't give them any data because, one, they're not watching you play. Like, how on earth are they going to know the detail of your performance, especially if you're a good player? And then secondly, you're not going to do a good job of necessarily, as the player, of being able to verbalize over a 36, 54, 72 hole event because you're going to probably focus some bias towards your driving, or you'll say, oh, I potted fine or something like that. So it's not objective enough, and it's just not helpful. So I wish I could almost like in school, like it has to be a part of your routine. It has to be part of your discipline, just like almost like part of a job, because it really is a habit that even if you don't see the value, every player would benefit from.
You have to have a deeply rooted belief that is going to help. And I think even if it saved you one stroke over the course of the year, it would have been beneficial and worthwhile. Let me talk a little bit about what we do on our end, because it's maybe the opposite end of the spectrum. But it's not to say that anybody couldn't, put this into place if they thought.
Sure.
And I think it's when you get more and more advanced, the low hanging fruit becomes a little bit higher and higher, like tougher to achieve, right? So you're getting from perhaps like a 78 scoring average to a 77 is more than likely like speed putting drills or something like that, just avoiding 3 putts that could get you there pretty quickly. But getting from 72 to 71.5 or 71.5 to 71, that's much tougher. And it might not be as apparent where that lowest hanging fruit is. You mentioned strokes gain information. I think that's critically important in all of this, because I think managing expectations around that and just knowing what the PGA Tour average is, I think is helpful in these conversations. Like, sure. I imagine, somebody say, oh, I missed 2 10-footers in a row. Well, there's actually a pretty decent chance you're going to miss 2 10-footers in a row, right? And if it causes you to question, like, oh, my putting stroke is off. Exactly. Well, it's like maybe that's just, like an 8-footer is like a roll of the die or a flip of the coin, right?
50-50, baby.
And there's going to be chances where God forbid, you might miss 3 in a row 12% of the time, right? That's just the odds of it. So in any case, like understanding the variance and volatility in those things relative to the tour average is helpful. So what I've done with Luke, and I've worked with a couple other juniors as well, is helping them track their stats, but it's all kind of deeply rooted in these PGA Tour numbers. So there's a lot of resources. If you go on the stats page, they track all sorts of stuff, right? Proximity to the hole from different distances in fairway or rough, strokes gained at different distances around the green and from different yardages in the fairway, the putting, the make rates at different, 8 to 10 feet, 10 to 15 feet, et cetera, et cetera. And we were able to construct this report, which basically I have a benchmark for, it's close to 130 different statistical measures. For Luke, we look at 10-round rolling tournament averages. So you have enough sample size to know that this is like a trend, right? And we look at the last 10 rounds relative to a benchmark. And the benchmark we initially started as like PGA Tour average, but I've since migrated him to the average of a PGA Tour player ranked, I think, 21 through 60. So like above average PGA Tour player. So it's a little bit of like a stretch goal in a number of these different categories. And the biggest thing, and probably the most critical thing of this is this concept of, you may have a gap in a certain category. Say it's bunker shots from 25 to 50 yards. And you might have a very significant gap between you and a PGA Tour average. Say your sand save percentage is 10% and the PGA Tour average is 50%. So there's a 40% gap there. But that shot may not come up very often in a round, right? It may come up like once every other round. So for each one of these categories, we calculate if there is a gap between where we are at over these last 10 rounds and this PGA Tour benchmark. But more importantly, the frequency in terms of how many times does it come up on average. So you have this gap times the frequency becomes the opportunity. So you may have a small gap on, say, 5-foot putts, but you might have 5 of those around. So that could turn out to be, a half a stroke of difference or 0.4 of a stroke difference. That may be a significant item to work on versus some obscure shot, 230-yard fairway shots or something like that. May only come up once around. It may not cost you that much in the end. So it's really meant to be a way to focus practice time, figure out what the lowest hanging fruit is. Like I said, we said last episode, Luke was playing multiple sports, and a lot of this originated from just absolutely needing to make efficient use of his practice time. So being able to sort out, what the lowest hanging fruit is and having dialogue with you in terms of these are the things I need to work on in my lesson. These are the things I need to work on in between lessons and just attacking it. So we really, anything when you get to a certain level, like anything that's worth like a quarter of a stroke or more, I think it's at least pursuing, perhaps a drill or some resource or whatever to try to attack that. And then just continuing to monitor how that's going and whether or not the drill is working, whether or not these trends are improving over time.
It's genius. I mean, it is, as Luke has gotten better or as players get better, it really does become much more difficult when they show up to a session to say, okay, well, what are we gonna work on today? Because as a coach, you just feel very unprepared, especially when you have a player that's as good as Luke, because you feel like you're doing them a disservice because you don't have a plan. And I think having that plan, not only as the coach, but just as the player, it can only lead to making faster improvement. You may luck into practicing the right things a majority of the time, but if someone else is doing that, they're probably going to get there faster.
Yeah, and I also think it can be validation that the hard work is paying off, right? Because maybe in the moment, they may not, like you may give them feedback in terms of a drill to work on, and like they're likely to do it or try it, but they'll fully buy in if they see that it's paid off in the results, and it all stemmed from the statistical analysis. Like maybe you never would have got to that point if you didn't have the stats helping to drive that dialogue and drive that decision. And I think once you start seeing results, then you can really double down on it, like in terms of your belief in it. So it's really meant to be a guide and an aid. I think you do need to balance this sort of discussion in terms of like, what was your takeaway, like in the moment playing in the tournament? And then if it's also supported by like, this is what the stats are saying as well, I think that helps having a meaningful conversation with you in terms of like, okay, what do we want to attack next? Like, what's the lowest hanging fruit? And how do I help improve on these things between now and whenever my next tournament is?
It made me think about when I had said earlier, like I like for everyone to check their strokes gained putting. It made me think about when a player comes to a lesson and says, okay, what do you want to do today? And they're like, I want to work on putting. It's like the vastness of working on putting. I mean, honestly, you could work on putting for hours because there are so many aspects of it that you would have to check the box on. And so even if a player was calculating their strokes gained, just to give some depth to what you're saying, all you're going to get is a number plus or minus relative to average. So -2 or +2. That still doesn't give any detail as to like, well, okay, where would I go from there other than I just need to practice putting more? Whereas if you knew your make percentage from 6 to 10 feet was a certain number and your benchmark was this, now you know at least I should be focusing in on this area. So that goes back to, that's a good starting point just to be able to know like, hey, I was -4 strokes gained putting. If that's the case, you probably need to practice all of your putting. But when you're talking about fractions, like I lost half a shot over an event, that can be very, very difficult to find. Like, okay, where is that half a shot on the putting green?
Just as an example, anybody wants some more information on this, like we publish this information freely. So Luke's Instagram handle is at LukeColton22. And on his profile page, there's a link that has a Google Doc that basically has all his stats going back the last 3 years. And sort of you can see the evolution of these stats and all of the information and the tour benchmarks that we look at. Anybody could just copy and paste that and use that as a template. Like that's the reason why we throw it out there, is just for anybody's benefit. It also shows exactly these like top 10 kind of low hanging fruit items that he's working on. We've got no problem like showing that and displaying it and just showing like, hey, this is how we're tackling it. Like I firmly believe in terms of helping the game push forward. I want to help everybody, even my son's most bitter rivals. I don't know if he has any bitter rivals, but just like people he's competing against week in and week out in these tournaments, we would be perfectly fine if they use this information to help themselves get better. I'm a huge believer in this, like high tide raises all boats, or whatever the saying may be. I think just pushing juniors and helping them, giving them the resources to get better, only means more opportunities and improvement for just about everybody. But just one example, I'm just looking at his report for full year 2023, from 10 to 15 feet on putting. On average, he's 0.11 strokes below the tour average. And the benchmark in terms of this at above average tour golfer is 0.03. And so there's a gap there, it's 0.14. And that putt on average happens 3.4 times around. So that gap, 0.14 times 3.4, is 0.48 strokes improvement. So if he was able to close that gap to turn a negative into a positive, and it happens nearly 3.5 times around, that's basically half a stroke off his scoring average. So that's like maybe the fifth or sixth item that's on his list. So it's just being armed with that information, like you said.
Yeah, giving attention to it, right?
I mean, I want to work on my putting. Yeah, because I think in the past,
doing a drill. I saw him today. He was doing a drill after our lesson for like an hour on the drill I gave him. That is supporting trying to fix that as best as we can.
Yeah, like a year ago, it was the 4 to 8 footers, right? And his 3-putt rate was, especially on lag putts, was much, much higher than tour average. And I believe this year he's basically at tour average. And I think it's as a result of working on these 4 and 5 footers. He's been really, really solid at that make rate. But I think it's maybe come at once he's tackled that hurdle, he's maybe hasn't focused on the mid-range, putts and making more birdies as a result of these 10 to 15 footers. Like we have a saying, like MB Park, like we're trying to get to MB Park level on who I think is probably the best 15-foot putter in the world. That's sort of the goal, is to keep attacking these different things and seeing the scoring average go down as a result. And who wouldn't want that, right?
For sure. The only thing I'll add to that is when people say that they have like routines, like that they just do the same thing every day, I always think there's no way that they do stats then. Because why would someone do the same, unless you have all day, unless you have 8 to 10 hours, there's no way to touch on everything that you need to touch on. You really wouldn't want to do routines. You'd want to diversify your practice from day to day or week, probably not day to day, but week to week, to touch on the things that you're seeing are the main problems. And hopefully those things are changing because you're solving them. And then just like with Luke, like as one thing improves, maybe something loses a little bit just because it didn't have as much attention. So I see that as a good thing when someone's like, yeah, I have a very diverse practice schedule. I don't really do the same thing every day because it seems like it's constantly changing based on my performance.
Last time we talked quite a bit about stats. We're in this season now. We talked to my friend Brian Hilko earlier this episode, just around like off-season golf and like indoor golf, him being in the Midwest. But I imagine a lot of golfers across the country, and even here in Texas, are sort of winding down their tournament season and getting in to the off-season, thinking about 2024 golf. And I just wanted to get your perspective, with the golfers that you work with. What's the best practice around just the off-season discussion, developing off-season plans, setting goals for the following year, and coming up with a plan to attack that. So maybe give us a little bit of perspective on like what you see as best practice in that space.
Yeah. I think the starting point in most of those conversations I have is reflecting on the year that you just had. Hopefully, players are in the practice of setting some outcome and performance goals for the year, just so they can objectively look back, stats aside, just saying, did I achieve any of the things that I wanted to, whether that's, something tangible like a trophy or something that you can track like a scoring average. But when you're looking to 2024, I would start with, I always ask this question, like if we're sitting here a year from now, like what would you hope would have happened in a year? Let's just say this is a fairly competitive player. Maybe that's, winning their first 2-day event, or I'm getting fully exempt on the AJGA. Whatever those things are, it would be nice to have them written down in some like tangible way, something they could look at. And so from there, it then leads to, well, what are the gaps in my performance that are likely causing me not to be reaching these goals? And so from there, I probably would be trying to come up with 4 or 5 areas, hopefully backed up with statistics, but doesn't necessarily have to be. For example, I have a couple players where they clearly don't hit it far enough. They don't necessarily need to be on TrackMan all the time, like testing their club head speed. But a goal would be, I need to be gaining club head speed. And then from there, I can make a plan. Like I'm going to start seeing a physical trainer. I'm going to order some type of speed training system. And I would probably come up with something in like each of the disciplines, like full swing, short game, putting, mental skills, tournament preparation. And if I have a goal in each one of those, then likely I'm going to see some improvement. And I think the more detail you can give those, you're likely going to reach those. In the beginning of 2024 to maybe the spring, it would be nice to like check in on those things to see how they're going and see if you need to like make an audible, because generally speaking, the summer is the most important part of like a junior's schedule. So by summertime, like you should be really, really caught up on what those 4 or 5 things are so that you have a really good summer, which will likely lead to meeting most of your goals in 24.
I think one of the things, it's tough to get off of the tournament cycle. And I think you really have to view it as an opportunity and as a gift to sort of be half a step removed or a step removed from tournament golf. Because I think these development things, like you obviously want to be getting better, but when you talk about like swing speed, when you're in the tournament season, like you always want to be ready to be able to play your best golf. So it's hard to really make a large investment in something where you might actually get worse before you get better, right? But when you have a chunk of, say, 3 or 4 months in between tournaments, you can really take that opportunity to make a large investment in your game and development. I do think, like you said, you need to have these checkpoints along the way. So some sort of test to show like, hey, you're making progress, or just probably check-ins with you in terms of how things are going, and, still be able to get, some sort of a gamification, and there's some sort of game-like situation that shows like, hey, we are making progress in the right direction. Like the work that you're putting in is getting us closer to that goal. Right.
Yeah. It's really rare for any level of golfer to have like 2 to 4 months off. Hopefully, like you just said, hopefully you're having those conversations with a coach. It's a lot to ask for just like a single junior player to come up with all this and to check this all on their own. So if you do have a coach, I would be having these conversations with them. Hopefully they're the ones leading it. Maybe that's a sign of a good coach that they're leading these conversations. And if not, then just bring it up saying, hey, can you help me come up with like 4 or 5 areas that you think I need to improve on? And if you do have those 2 to 4 months off, then I think you're totally right. It is such an opportunity, and it really doesn't happen often. So lean into it. I know it can be hard, like not playing tournaments, because it's kind of hard to know if you're getting better. But if you're doing those things over those 2 to 4 months, you're likely going to see a lot of fruit when the tournament season does start back up.
Yeah, especially on driving distance, right? You'll be finding new places, new spots on the course you probably hadn't found before, reaching par 5s that you hadn't reached before, that sort of thing.
Yeah, that's a good point. I'm like, if we did take driving distance is something that is very, very easy to see like the fruit, because you can see a gain in club head speed, and then you can see a gain in ball speed, and maybe that even has to do with like getting fit for a driver, so my spin's better. I mean, you could say I want to gain 50 yards, which is I got to gain X amount of ball speed, I got to lose X amount of spin, I'm going to add half an inch to my driver. Like, this is a very tangible way. For some of the other things, for example, like maybe it's mental skills are like a little bit more difficult to like tangibly see the fruit. You know it's there, and maybe you do like a mental scorecard. So again, if you can be as detailed in those things as you can, I think then you can like easily see, okay, I did gain some ground in this area.
You talked about goal setting. Can you talk a little bit about like the top elite players that you've seen, or some of the even the professional players that you've been around or observed? Like, describe sort of their ability to describe their game, like articulate their game, articulate their needs, and articulate their goals. I imagine it can be very, very precise because they're able to articulate their games in a very nuanced fashion. Does that help in those discussions?
Yeah, I think as you get closer to the mountaintop, like the goals become more clear too. For example, if you're a top ranked junior in the country, like the things that are the mountaintop things, most kids that aren't even in that space could also say those, like AJGA wins, or being a Rolex player of the year, or qualifying for US Junior. And when you're a lower level junior, let's say you're starting to compete, it's hard to say like what that goal would be, because it's a little bit more vast as far as your opportunity. Like, there's a ton of things to do, where there's only one US Junior or one US AM. And so even with professional players saying, I want to earn Corn Ferry status, there's only one or two ways to do that. And then once they have that goal, it becomes very, very easy to work your way back, because it's so limited in how you would go about doing that. And then if they do have statistics to back that up, the outcome turning into the performance-based stuff, it's very easy to find the performance areas that it's going to take to reach those things. Again, as we have talked about many times, set a goal, set something objective, and just work your way backward. Always has to start. I think it always has to start with some type of outcome, whether you are trying to be on the PGA Tour or you're just trying to go and play your first competitive event. Like, I remember when my son played his first tournament, it was literally, let's just set the goal. We're just going to go play a tournament, which now means I have to be educated as to how to sign up for a tournament, where the tournament is, maybe go play a practice round. Like, there are going to be little things that obviously a tour player is not going to have to think on that level. But you will grow in your knowledge of like how to achieve these things if you just start with the objective goal.
Yeah, and we had this similar conversation with my son Luke just a few weeks ago, Andrew, and I think it's exactly that. I mean, I think we started with just having him talk about his goals for the upcoming year and articulate where he thought his game was at and what he needed to work on. I think the stats definitely played a role in those conversations, and that was what hopefully I was able to bring to the table. And I think the thing is, like, it's nice when the stats provide the support in an objective way that supports sort of what the player is seeing and experiencing in the field. And I think that was the case in our discussion. And I think that gave us really the focus around the goals. We were able to sort of quantify what were the things, like the largest gaps between where he was in 2023 and where he wanted to be in 2024. And then I think the next step was like, okay, well, let's come up with the plan of attack to try to address that. And in our case, like you said, we have about 3.5 months of downtime. How are you going to just start chipping away at this? Like, what does, how often is he meeting with you, and what are the things you're going to work on? And, coming up with a practice plan and a development plan that, like you said, makes you ready and bulletproof for summer 2024 to be able to achieve, what frankly were very lofty goals going into next year. So I think that's, in my mind, seeing the process come together. But I think it really starts with the player being able to articulate exactly what where they think their game is, and where they want to be, like you said, a year from now.
Yeah. it really is up to the player. I think when a player has very like clear goals, hopefully his team around him, like you and I are doing for Luke, or like I'm doing for the players that I coach, can help like lay a very clear framework to how would I actually achieve that. And are these goals things that I think that I could achieve in 2024? If you're a beginner competitive junior, saying that you're going to go win on the AJGA next summer is probably not like the most realistic thing. But that may be a goal that you want in 4 or 5 years. So if we had that mountaintop goal, we could work our way back 4 or 5 years to go, okay, in 4 or 5 years, it's going to look like this. What are the first steps in 2024 that I would hopefully take that would in 2030 or 2029, I can see that as a realistic thing, which one of those would be gaining competitive experience. Okay, I need to play in 12 events this year. That would be a good starting point, and something that would make the road seem much more tangible versus just saying, well, I hope in 6 years that this just kind of works out. You know, this hoping that things happen. It's a strategy. I don't know if it's a good one.
Any guidance for parents on this front? Because I imagine one thing that I would sort of caution is focusing too much on what like one other individual or junior, say in your state, or somebody who's ranked ahead of you, or even like somebody who might be in your kid's grade who's eons of where your son or daughter is now. And I think as parents, like we get caught in that trap of FOMO or focusing too much on any one individual. So can you talk a little bit about like just maybe tempering those expectations? And like you said, like setting realistic goals and helping the parent realize like their son or daughter's on this journey. And it may take time and it may be on a different pace. But if we set these goals and we keep chipping away at it, like we'll make progress on that front.
Yeah, I mean, that is, whenever I read any like parenting, like sport, document or like book, it always says never compare your kid to another kid. Like that, it doesn't matter like what it is. That's always the one thing. Don't talk about the performance within 24 hours and don't talk about other kids. I really do think there's a lot of truth to that, because everyone is starting this race at a different point. And oh, by the way, the race doesn't have an ending. Like it doesn't end when your kid goes to college, because guess what? They get to college and now they're playing against the best players in the country. So you've never really achieved the end goal. Even if you reach number one in the world, guess what? There's 100 guys behind you that are trying to catch you. So I think patience from the parent's perspective, listen to your child and what they want and what they're desiring to do. And then all you can do is just put them in the best space, hopefully with a good coach that can kind of like drive the ship to help them reach those things. Inevitably, I think a kid will probably try to compare themselves, especially if there's like this kid that's just like destroying them every week, and just saying, stay patient, stay patient. Luckily, I have a lot of experience with this as my son, he's kind of been on the smaller side. He hasn't been able to like dominate, local tours like some of the kids have. And just for years, I've just said, hey, we just got to keep focusing on what we're doing. As you get bigger, you're going to have more and more chances. And as the last year or so have happened, he's definitely starting to like show some fruit from our patience and like being good at the things that we can control, like chipping and putting and bunkers and course strategy and tournament preparation, to where, I'm hoping that as he gets, bigger, faster, stronger, all those things that we did 4 or 5 years ago will really serve him, as now he can hit it as far as everybody. So that's kind of a tangible example, just from my life. And I've had other kids that are in similar. I just had a kid the other day I saw that I'm telling him, let's just be patient. I know you jumped up in yardage. There's nothing you can do. Like just control the things that you can control, which is your effort, your attention, and your conversations, and be patient.
Yeah, I think the only thing that I would leave on, that's great advice, is I mentioned it earlier, and I also mentioned it to my son, that if you think of it as an investment and think of it as the amount of work that you put in this off season, like your performance next year is largely going to be a function of that hard work, that investment. And like I said, just like you say, like climbing a mountain, right? You got to do it one step at a time. You got to put the work in. You can't skip any steps along the way. And I think if you just view it as just really an investment in your future golf performance, and just really attack it that way, like you'll see the fruits of that labor, and it will be like it'll be extremely rewarding. Like I think just that journey, just enjoying the journey and enjoying the work and enjoying the process.
I think,
Andrew, if
I would add a little caveat. If it's not working, like what you were doing is not working, I do see a lot of people that just like stay down the path, whether that be with their current coach or, with their current schedule, and they just kind of stay the same and they're very, very frustrated. Like, don't be afraid to change it up. Like, it's okay. This is a performance-based business. If you're not succeeding or you're not getting better, then you should question like what you're doing, and that's okay. People change coaches, people get new clubs, people go see, mental coaches, they go see different trainers. It's totally fine. You should to a degree, you should kind of always be questioning your path just to make sure that you're on the right path, or else you're just going to kind of wake up one day and be like, oh, it's been 5 years and I'm kind of in the same spot. So, don't be afraid of some change.
Last episode, we talked about off-season development plans. I think an offshoot of that, as we talk about 2024, start thinking about tournament selection. And I imagine, day to day, week to week, as you're walking the fairways with Andrew, you got a lot of with Cameron, a lot of parents come up to you, just asking questions, seeking your advice. I imagine there's a lot of questions that come up. I get questions quite a bit from other golf parents around what tournaments to play in, what tournaments to avoid. How do you optimize, the tournament, this finite number of tournaments that your son is going to play in over the course of the year? So is this something that you see quite a bit in your travels?
Yes, I'd say when I am out on the prowl at a tournament, that's probably the number one question I get is, when should we start playing, a certain level? When should we start traveling? And I want to preface it by saying this, like there is no right or wrong way. I have seen players go to the best programs in the country doing multiple strategies. And we'll define two. One would be playing, national events, very high level AJGA, non-AJGA amateur stuff, which there is a ton of benefit to doing that. And then I've also seen players that have not left the state of Texas for the most part, that just play really, really well in the stuff that they could get in. And they also ended up at a very, very similar program, if not the same program. So at the end of the day, if your player is winning, even on the local level, that's going to grab attention. So, okay. So having said that, if it was up to me and, money wasn't necessarily an issue, I could travel, then I am trying to come up with what is the best schedule that my child could play. And if you have to define what best is, there's going to be some criteria, like AJGA point values or, world amateur ranking points or course rating for JGS consideration. You can start to define what that would be for a top level player. Speaking for me, for my son, for this year is going to be one of our goals is to get fully exempt on the AJGA. So I don't really care about any of that stuff. Mine is just get him into as many of those opportunities as I can. So I think and we've talked many times about goals. I think you have to start with what is the competitive goal, the outcome goal for the year, and work your way back. So for us, it's going to be getting fully exempt on the AJGA. For a player like Luke, that's going to be very, very different because he is ahead of Cameron in that regard. For other players, it's going to be playing in 4 2-day counting events. So I can just have a ranking on Junior Golf Scoreboard, something like that. So it really is all over the place as far as what you may want to happen. Something tangible that I would do is I would focus on creating a schedule that would be like your A schedule. And as the schedules are coming out, write down the dates, choose the events that you would like to play, realizing that you may not get into some of them, and then create a B schedule. Have a secondary event that would be okay to play in. It's not your A event, but it's okay. Have a B event and live in that world of I've done everything I can. I've planned out as much as I can. And based on your son or daughter's performance, that's going to change as they play better. Then those A events are going to come up. If you do that you're ahead of 95% of the people. Yeah, I really think that.
That's interesting you said that, because that's exactly what we did last year. We had an A, B, and even like a C option. And right around this time, last year, or if you look now, most of the golf schedules for 2024 are either have recently been published or they will be published soon.
They have been.
And we just created a calendar that had every day of the year with multiple columns, and I sort of categorized it between AJGA and, here in Texas, Legends events and the different options. And then also like the national events and any other amateur events where they sort of slot in. So, you immediately know what sort of the conflicts are. Like if I pick this event, that means I can't play in that event. And if I had to choose, I would prioritize one or the other. If I get into this, then I'm going to play in it. If not, I'm going to select this other one. The other thing which becomes a little bit tricky is the USGA qualifiers. They come out a little bit early, kind of next year, and they don't always quite fit nice and neatly into the regular kind of junior tournament schedules. So you have to sort of align those two together. And obviously, playing in those events, I think any junior should be likely trying to get into the events, at least a US junior, if you think you're ready. Just getting the experience of playing in the USGA qualifier is worthwhile.
For sure.
It starts to come together, I think, once you get them all on a piece of paper. You did mention, like, you have to be fluid. As the season goes along, opportunities are going to open themselves up. And it might actually mean like withdrawing out of a tournament because like you've achieved the goal. Like if you get halfway through the summer and Cameron locks up, gets the top 5 and gets the full exempt for next year, it's a little bit like a safety school when you're selecting, you're applying for colleges. It's like you've got basically accepted into, your next year is sort of locked up. So then therefore it might not make sense to play in this tournament, which you maybe saw as like a decent chance of getting a top 5. Like you have to be willing, to be flexible on that front. A lot of times, like, frankly, you may sign up for a handful of events and end up canceling and eating the $25 cancellation fee, but just having a spot held in that field and having the optionality to play in it has value, right? As opposed to
I've lost so much money doing that. Yes. It's so frustrating. I could probably pay for an entire tournament season with the amount of money I've lost from secondary events. But I mean, it just is what it is. Like, and unless you have status everywhere, you're a top junior, you're just always going to be kind of like living between two places. And there's really no way around that. So you just have to plan for what you hopefully will happen. And then, what you for sure can play in. And, don't be frustrated by it. Everyone's in it. I think you'll feel much, much better if you have a plan. I know that's the way that I am. And yes, most of the 2024 schedule out, I have pretty much already made the schedule. I've made the schedule for Cameron and multiple players already. So I don't think it's ever too early to start trying to plan the schedule. And you can always change it. That's fine. But 50% of the people I coach are late to the game. And then they'll kind of like complain about how the tour, needs to change their system. You just got to be quick. You got to be really, really quick. Because not everything is like merit based. Sometimes it's just who's the first one to sign up. So be quick with the click. We wake up at 6 a.m. when they open.
The only other thing I would say around this, just from my experience, as you're coming up through the ranks and maybe going from more of the local events into the AJGAs and potentially the national events. Last week we talked about really not focusing on like what any one other individual is doing. One of the things that I found was helpful early on when I was just trying to get a sense of the landscape is you can go on Junior Golf Scoreboard and look at on a broader scale, like what like a group of like a subsection of players. Maybe it's the players in your state that are ranked ahead of where your son is, a grade ahead or 2 grades ahead or whatever, looking at them in mass and then seeing like how many tournaments did like 5 or more of these players play in? Like that's helping you kind of formulate like, oh, the better players are sort of playing in, say, the Junior Byron Nelson here in Texas, or, just getting a sense for like tournaments that kids in your area are going to. It may be AJGAs, but they're more local. Like maybe it's in Arkansas, or you're not having to travel super, super far. I think you can start to get a sense of that without really focusing on like, oh, that kid's playing in this event, therefore I need to be playing in this event. But if you look at this kind of broad swaths of groups of players, like you can start to get a sense of that. The other tidbit that I would have is, I think you need to have a real honest assessment of like where your son or daughter is sort of in the spectrum, because playing in a tournament where, they're by far the best player in the field, that doesn't really do your child much good. Like they really have, they'll get a trophy or whatever if they win, but like they have very little to gain and much to lose, right? If they don't win the tournament, then they're dejected because, they didn't perform as highly. And if they won, they were sort of expected to win. And then on the flip side, if you focus too much on like, oh, well, this person got into this tournament, therefore my son needs to be playing in this tournament, but they're not quite ready for it. Like that can be a demoralizing thing in and of itself, right? And then even like something like an AJGA preview, right, where you really only get one chance at doing that. Can be a big jumpstart for the vaunted kind of PBEs or the stars or whatever they call it. But you'd really need to be in the top half of the field or feel like you have a good chance of being in the top half of the field to get those stars and sort of launch your AJGA career, for lack of a better term. Otherwise, if you're in the bottom five, that was largely a waste of time. Like you missed your shot. Like you should have probably waited until your child was more ready to do that. So the one thing that the sort of rule of thumb that I sort of targeted was what I would call like the 25th percentile rule, which was I wanted my son to be sort of in that 25th or 33rd percentile within the strength of the field. So there are players that are better than my son entering a tournament, and there's something to be gained for sure from being in a tournament and seeing how good players go about their business. That's really one of the key ways of getting better. And one of the takeaways from these tournaments is just trying to take away little bits and pieces from the players you're paired up against, or like seeing how the leaders handle their business and go about their business. But being sort of in, closer to the 25th or 33rd percentile, meaning that in order for my son to be in contention, he would have to play relatively well, but he does have an opportunity to win. And I think any tournament you want to really kind of be in the hunt, right? So knowing that you need to play well, hopefully showing up for that week and playing well and being in one of those last few groups and going through those reps and getting that experience and handling that pressure and, learning from those experiences. So that's sort of been the guiding process. So as your son or daughter improves, like the strength of the field should improve along with it. And the tournaments you sort of focus on should improve along the way. So that's been sort of our guiding principle as we've sort of gone through this evolution.
That's awesome. Yeah, I've seen a lot of growth with you guys. Luke only played his first AJGA, a couple of years ago. I think it can happen really fast. And I have seen it happen fast for multiple players. And you audible, you just adjust as things come your way and you just make a new plan. The thing is, I think it'd be easy, or we should say, like, obviously we probably sound fairly educated on this. At the end of the day, we're both just golf dads. I happen to coach players, but I don't help everyone with their competitive schedule. A lot of this is learned just because of necessity for me trying to help my son and you trying to help your son as much as possible. And so my advice to parents would be lean into learning as much as you can. Like when you get introduced to the AJGA, read all of like the inside the rankings information so you understand like what you're getting into. Like not all of them are equal weighted. For example, around here, if you're playing, like you mentioned, the Legends Tour, like read through their PBE policy and like what their tournament exemptions get, because they are different from event to event. And the more educated you are, I think you'll feel much better about like creating the schedule versus just signing up because the dates work, like that. There's going to be a point where that just doesn't matter. It's not about dates. It's about like, what is the benefit of the event in front of you, which most kids playing do get to a point where they're playing in something that has some benefit. So it's good to know what that is.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, because even like you said, I think last year was Luke's first year in AJGA. And I thought I was well versed on this, but one of the things, you you only get to play in 5 of these tournaments, AJGA tournaments. And I actually didn't realize that a preview tournament didn't count as one of the 5s. And I thought I had read everything. So we had avoided the previews, because we wanted to focus on, say, the junior all-stars at that point in time, and then leaving room for some of the open events. And we ended up honestly scrambling, going to far-flung places because we didn't have great status, or you didn't have great status. And you had to basically go where you could get in. Right. And thankfully it all worked out fine, but we were going to South Dakota and, St. Louis. And
that's where we're going this year. That's where I'm going.
Exactly.
Tell me where to eat in South Dakota.
Yeah. But if you think about it, if I had known better, we would have done a preview in the spring. He maybe would have gotten 6 or 8 PBEs and been much better shape to play, a little bit closer to home. But yeah, that was just ignorance on my part. And it's confusing, right? I mean,
it's so confusing.
Yeah, it is very confusing. I ended up modeling all of these tournaments based on Luke's junior golf scoreboard and the strength of last year's field and whether or not what the AJGA points would be and what the distribution of his outcomes would be and whether or not it added value to it or not. And that's how we used, because a lot of times you're selecting between tournament A or B or C, 7 different events you could play.
Yeah.
Right. So you have to decide, based on who's entered it, can you get in?
It's exhausting.
How many points is it worth? Some of them have minimum points. You mentioned goals. And I would say, more importantly, have every decision sort of hinge on the goal. So once the goal is, say, achieved, be willing to pivot away from that, set the next objective. You may have a breakthrough, like you said, and it gets you into this whole new universe of, say, AJGA invitationals, the top inner circle. And maybe your space is secure there. And then before you're, say, optimizing for PBE points, now you're trying to optimize for AJGA and eventually maybe even WAGR points, right? And you can start thinking about the the WAGR implications and amateur events and how those sort of filter in. The other thing I say, we could talk about ratings and rankings, and maybe we take that offline if people want to reach out, and I'm more than happy to have discussions around that. But I think the one thing is, if you're going to make a stretch, there are probably local events, even pro events. I think about, I think you turned me on to a mini tour event for Luke last January, which wasn't anywhere on my radar, right? Or on our radar. And we entered it, and he was in the final group the second day and performed well. And I think that actually, propelled him to success and belief that he could play at a very high level. And I think those sorts of things are even a US amateur qualifier. No one's expecting probably a 15-year-old kid or 16-year-old kid to qualify. You really have nothing to lose. You don't really have rankings implications for that. He played in a pre-qual for the Byron Nelson and made it through. So there are opportunities out there. Yeah, there are opportunities out there. Just seek them out. And I think if you're gonna stretch and maybe see where you're at, do it when very little to lose, right? And see what can happen. And you never know, it might propel them to a new level of confidence and performance.
Yeah, for sure. As you're going through this junior golf life, every time you get comfortable, you're put into the next uncomfortable phase, right? So you start winning locally, then you start playing this stuff. And so you're just constantly trying to see, do I fit in at the next level? And so I think doing things like that and how it did help Luke gain confidence, it's just because now he's doing something that he didn't think he could do. He's oh, I can do it. It's not that different than playing against really good 18-year-olds. Which if you couple those, if you just keep doing those little things and leveling up, eventually, you're at the top, and it's I knew I could do this because I just kept doing it at every level. So yeah, those stretch goals are really important.
Yeah. One last thing, Andrew, before we wrap up, we recently had a conversation about just what these tournaments mean in the grander space of golf development and, tournament performance, opening doors for other tournaments and these events getting bigger and bigger. For a lot of junior golfers, and I imagine the pressure that they're on, that can be a bit daunting and that can impact their performance. So How do you help junior golfers and maybe parents sort of deal with sort of the increasing landscape and maybe the focus around like the tournaments, the points, the rankings, and the exemptions that come along with tournament performance?
Yeah, that is a good question. I do have a lot of people will say like, well, don't think about the rankings or don't think about what it means. And I always say, like, that's fine, but it's unavoidable at a point. Like, you are going to think about this stuff, and not thinking about it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. And not thinking about it doesn't mean that it's going to be that much easier. Like, it's okay to know that the consequence of if you play well or don't play well. And if you continue to get better and you do go play in college, you're going to have to deal with having to qualify against some of the best players. And if you do turn professional, you are going to have to like finish at a certain point on the money list or make it through Q school. And then even when you make on the PGA Tour, you have to understand your schedule and like which tournaments are better. So like this idea that we need to like shelter and protect the junior golfer from like too much internal pressure, I think in a degree it can do them a disservice, because at some point they're just going to have to learn to deal with that. And so having them start to deal with that on a lower level is probably more beneficial than like, oh, now you're at the University of so-and-so and you're having to qualify against, 4 top 100 WAGR ranked players. It's like, you don't even know what that even means, versus just being educated on it. And I think that would serve them a lot better if you just had like a conversation with them about it. And the more educated they are, maybe when they're in 10th place, they realize like, oh man, if I can finish 10th, that's probably going to help me in my overall ranking, which will help me get into so-and-so. As Kevin Kisner said, they pay a lot of money for 20th place. Like, it's okay. You don't have to always think about, winning. There's a lot of value in just like understanding the landscape. And kids are very, very adaptable. Like, they're not going to just like crumble under the pressure, and hiding the reality from them isn't going to help anyway. So not from my experience. So I'd lean into it. And I haven't seen that backfire. I mean, my son and I have these conversations all the time about rankings, and like his goal, like one of his goals is to be ranked top 10 in his class. Like, he's very aware of like what that means and what that takes. So when he's 8 over through 17, he's totally aware that like, yeah, this round it's still better to shoot 78 versus 80.
Yeah, that's great. And I think the only thing is, like, if you follow the trajectory of your son or any other junior golfer, there is going to be a natural progression where the tournaments only get bigger and bigger and bigger. So getting wigged out in a tournament and maybe overcoming that and breaking through that, that's just going to set you up for, I think, more success in the next tournament, which is probably going to be a little bit bigger. And then like eventually, like you said, like a USGA event, and then ultimately, hopefully, like Q school and so on and so forth. It's just, all the way to majors. Like, they just keep getting bigger and bigger. And I think what you see even in the professional ranks, like Scotty Scheffler is a perfect example. Like, once he had the breakthrough, he had a lot of near misses, had the breakthrough, and then he's taken off like a rocket since then. Those are great things to see and observe. And I think it's a great thing on the junior golf development to see your son or daughter kind of gain in confidence, having gone through this experience and having these breakthroughs.
Well, because that's part of their development too, as much as it is their physical side, it's their mental side. And it's back to what we said a few minutes ago, just they have to believe that they can do it. And until they do it, there really is going to be that lack of belief. But once you start doing it, like, the confidence grows, just like you saw in Scheffler, just like I see I swear, every year there's like 5 kids. I'm like, man, where'd that kid come from? And then he just like stays there, or she stays there, because it's like, now I know I can do it. Where their skills are probably good enough, and it's like, I just don't know why they haven't done it. And then they do it, and now they're on their way.
So let's just presume that you've sorted out the tournaments you're going to play. You got them on the calendar for 2024, and you're getting closer to that event, say within 3 or 4 weeks to that event, up until like the week and the days leading up to the event. So the first section I want to talk about is just what I would call like pre-tournament tournament prep. And then we can get into like when you actually get at the event, like practice round, and then even during the event, pre-round, post-round, in between rounds, like that sort of thing. We'll cover those in future episodes. But this one I really wanted to focus on, to say like the days and weeks leading up to the event. What are some of the best practices that you've seen that you would recommend that your junior golfers are doing? I was thinking about earlier when you talked about Cameron And we were talking about driving distance, and was lacking his peers. But what you had said to him is like, well, control what you can control. And one of the things you mentioned in that episode, I believe it was episode 3, was really you can control your tournament prep. You can use that as a differentiator. You can use that as an advantage. Most people think of like golf skill as like your driving distance or like your putting, but this is another thing that's going to ultimately determine success. Those that do it well can differentiate from those that are maybe just ignoring it completely. So I don't know if you found that to be your experience, but maybe we'll just let you rip on this.
Yeah. So since we're going to talk about what to do during a practice round in a later episode, let's assume that you're going to a golf course that you've never been to, and this is prior to a practice round. So if I were to think, okay, how do I show up? And a lot of times when a kid does a practice round or a pro, they're doing the practice round like the day before. And there's a lot of benefit to that. But let's say that you're playing a tournament in 3 weeks. Okay, so what would it look like to be as prepared as I can for where I'm about to go play? And number one would be ordering a yardage book. I know we have our partnership with StrackaLine. StrackaLine is, I think, the best as far as just the data being accurate. It is a lot of data. So I also have used other ones that are similar, but StrackaLine definitely gives you the best greens data and the best, like cover yardages on bunkers, things like that. So for sure, having the yardage book weeks in advance is helpful because you can start scouting the course. You could scout the course with StrackaLine and also combine that, let's say, with Google Earth or some type of app like 18 Birdies. And you can start to get a flow of like what the golf course is going to be like. Is it tree lined? Does it have a lot of bunkers? Does it have a lot of water? Do the greens look big? Do the greens look small? And based on understanding the environment you're about to enter, that would start to influence how you would spend your time. So let's take an example. So if I told you, Jim, it looks like it's tree lined, what would you be spending more time working on 3 weeks headed off into your event?
Yeah, I mean, I would think about driving accuracy and also hitting 3 woods and long irons off, at the driving range as well.
Exactly. If you were measuring the greens and you saw they were all 40 yards in depth and 30 yards in width, you're probably going to be working on lag putting. If you see that the greens are really, really small, you're probably going to go work on your short game. If you see there's a ton of bunkers, you're going to definitely prioritize that. So I think the more that you can focus on learning the golf course without necessarily being on the golf course is going to really inform your practice. Other things that would serve a player well would be to look at things like historical scoring. Most events have had an event at that golf course in the past. If that's the case, I think it's helpful to know, what the winning score was, what the top 5 score was, what a top 20 score was. It's also good to look at the historical scoring from the perspective of which holes were the 6 hardest. That's going to help inform your strategy. If I can just make a 4 or a 5 on this hole, I'm beating the field by half a shot or a full shot. Other things, especially down here in Texas, like the weather can be incredibly unpredictable. So one of the things I like to look at would be something called like Weather Underground. It's a website that gives you historical weather data that just kind of informs what the weather's likely going to be like, or it might paint a picture as to like why the scores were really high last year at that event. Let's say it was like a north wind, blowing 20 miles an hour. So if you do all of those things, if you look at Google Earth, if you look at your StrackaLine, if you look at historical scoring, you look at the upcoming weather, that should give you a really good framework of what's likely you're going to be expecting before you get on property. What I see happen when players get on property the day of their practice round, they haven't done any of that, is it's almost like they're cramming for this test and they just miss a lot of things because it's like, oh, I've got to learn the golf course. I've got to figure out strategy. I've got to figure out if it's a north wind or a south wind, what am I going to hit? Where if you were to do a lot of that homework, in theory, you could have your tee shot strategy pretty much done before you've ever stepped on the golf course. And all you're doing is affirming all of those things. So the players that do that, which I'd say it's a very small portion that actually do that, they definitely show up more prepared than the average kid that's just doing a practice round. I don't think a practice round is much of a separator these days. I mean, most players are doing that at a minimum.
You mentioned the yardage books, and as you mentioned, we have a partnership with StrackaLine. If you go to the website and you order a yardage book, which you absolutely, I think it's a must-have, a yardage book, any yardage book going into a tournament. But StrackaLine's offering 20% off. If you use the code DRIVEN at checkout, you get 20% off a yardage book. So take advantage of that for sure. I mean, we've used different yardage books. We use Decade Golf, which you can print them out at home. And we still use that. Like Luke will use that for high school tournaments. And the one thing I like about Decade is they will give you the fairway widths at different yardages that you can set. Like I think the default is probably 250, 275, 300.
Yeah.
Which is sort of a nice thing. It's just like a table that has those numbers. So I think as far as like tee selections and knowing, how skinny the fairway is, where the hazards are, or sort of in your normal kind of carry or total distance off the tee, you can really get a feel for that. But that simple kind of, black and white printout. We've used Putt View as well. And we have migrated to...
Putt Views are pretty good.
We've migrated to StrackaLine more recently. And yeah, I mean, and we talk about tournament selection, like we have most of our schedule planned out for next year. And I don't give this away, but like somebody might be getting something in their stocking, which is like 5 or 6 yardage books for tournaments we know we're going to be playing in 2024.
He's excited about that.
Yeah, so it makes a great gift around the holidays. So yeah, that's great. I actually what you said about the hole by hole scores, I think that's really important because I think the expectations around what the difficult holes are. I've seen, and I'm sure you've seen, junior golfers become unwound over one bogey, right? But it might be a bogey on a hole that's playing 0.7 strokes above par, right?
Yeah, you're barely losing anything. Yeah. I think knowing that gives you some freedom when you do hit a bad drive. Okay, if I can just make a 5 on this hole, I'm barely losing anything. The other thing I wanted to say about prep is, especially as you are playing more elevated events where, we'll say, there's a point where everyone's skill is fairly good, and you can walk up and down the range and it's like, man, it's hard to tell who's the best player. When you start doing a lot of these things that we'll just call like separators, it does separate you from your competition if you show up being the most prepared, because the margins are so small. And so if I'm able to make 2, 3, 4, 5 decisions better than somebody else, and that translates to 2, 3, 4, or 5 shots, I mean, that is a massive difference. And even if that's finishing in the middle of the pack versus, the bottom third, every little bit counts, just like we've talked about with rankings. Like every shot really does matter. And so the hesitation a lot of kids have is like, well, until my ball control is good enough, or until I'm doing things well enough, I don't think I need to do that. It's like that. In some ways, it's almost like the opposite. This stuff can help you save so many shots just by making better decisions. And so if you can get in those habits, don't do everything at once. Maybe it's just starting with ordering a yardage book, and then adding the historical scoring, and just kind of coming up with your own conviction of like what it means to you to show up ready. I promise that you will shoot lower. There's no way you're going to shoot worse because you're more prepared.
Yeah, I mean, I think the one thing that's related to that is the confidence of going into an event, knowing that you are feeling like you are the most well-prepared player in the field. And just going as opposed to, like you said, like cramming for the test, or maybe the practice round didn't go quite as well, and you weren't maybe in the right spots that you needed to be, but then you feel like you're scrambling entering the first day of the tournament, like you feel a little bit unprepared. I don't think that puts you in the best position to play your best golf. And you hit on it perfectly. I mean, I can tell you for a fact that one stroke over the course of a season can mean the difference between getting into a very elite event or not, right? So are you willing to do the hard work? And this is hard work, right? But I think everybody would like a lower scoring average than a higher scoring average, all else equal. Everybody would like higher finishes. So it's really the conviction of believing that this is important enough that it will improve your game over the course of a season, even if it didn't impact you that tournament, but it's the right thing to do. So I think directionally, folks should definitely take this to heart.
Yeah, to give you a little bit of context and example, I had a lesson today with a kid, and we were talking about an upcoming event, and he played a practice round. And I said, well, what hole are you going to hit? What are you going to hit off this hole? And he said, I'm going to hit driver. And I said, well, what was the wind during your practice round? He said, well, it was south. I said, well, have you looked at the weather for this weekend? He's like, no. I said, well, it's going to be a north wind blowing 20.
He's like, oh. So now it's like he's doing this practice round, which is good, but he's not necessarily considering like what the conditions are going to be like. So now his whole strategy to a degree is kind of flipped because he's not understanding that the golf course might be different. So, just paying attention to that stuff. It's not that the practice round is useless. It's just you'll probably get more out of it if you understand like the likelihood of what it's going to be like, or consider both. Don't just be like, well, I hit driver 2 weeks ago, I'm going to hit driver now. It's just not necessarily like a high level way of thinking.
So Andrew, we talked about the preparation for the tournament and observing like what you're going to need for the course. And let's just assume it's a big event and it's 3 weeks away. And you've done your homework, you've done your due diligence, you've done everything that you outlined earlier. At the end of the day, like the success in that tournament is going to be also a huge function of execution. So what is like the dialogue between a junior player and a coach like yourself leading into the event in terms of like you have maybe say 2 or 3 touch points leading up to the event in getting the skills optimized for the things that you're going to need to have for that tournament or in just the communication between player and coach around that?
Yeah, so I won't necessarily be like skill specific because each event you're going to have a skill that might be more important than another. But just in general, like having your plan is great, but you need to be able to execute your plan. So, if you think it's your four major skills of, ball striking, distance wedges, short game putting, I would definitely be like giving full attention to those 4 things, whether that's with your coach or with not, of like, what does it mean to have full control and predictability in those areas? So let's just take one. We'll take putting. So if you think about what it would mean to be optimized putting, I would be able to start the ball on line, whether that's doing some type of drill or some type of putting mat, whether that's hitting it through some tees, likely having some video of that, like making sure my symmetry is good, making sure my form is good. Like that would be step 1. Step 2 would be having really good touch. So like heading and doing a lot of speed control drills with very like specific metrics. There's a ton of drills that I go through that would be specific to like 10 footers all the way to like 60 footers. And then 3 would be green reading, doing some drills that like force you to have to like put a gate or doing some sort of drill using aim point. And then if you're doing those things and they have very specific metrics, like scores, for example, then it's easy as you're heading into the event to see like, yeah, I'm dialed in that area, or I need to be giving more attention in my lessons or in my practice to like this area because it doesn't quite feel like it's at an A level. And I think if you can create that conviction or that plan in those 4 major areas, along with your preparation, like you should be fairly ready to go come game time.
Yeah, that's great. And then, like we said, as far as like tournament prep leading to confidence going into the event, like I think being absolutely dialed in the skills that you're going to need for the tournament, that seems like you're unbeatable at that point. And I'd imagine being a junior, having that mindset going into a tournament on the first tee, that's got to be a great feeling.
Oh, for sure. If you think about like driving and, and you're on the range and you're hitting and you're like heel cutting like every 4th ball, like you're probably not going to go to the first tee and be like, yeah, I'm feeling great with my driver. Now, maybe you start hitting it well, but most likely over like 36 holes or 54 holes, like that same dumb low heel shot that spins to the right when you're trying to hit a draw is going to show up. And so I think like the more that you can recognize those patterns heading into it and not like, oh, I hope it gets better. Like hope is not a good solution. Solving those things, that's what's going to give you confidence. It's not like talking yourself up. Like talking yourself up is not going to do any good as soon as you heel cut one out of bounds on hole 4 and you're like, okay, I've got 14 more holes to go and I really don't know where the ball is going to go. Oh wait, yes I do. It's going to go to the right probably. Like that's just it's likely not going to lead to very good golf.
Yeah, that's great. Well, you're dropping some truth bombs here in episode 7, so I really appreciate that. Yeah, we'll talk about practice.
We can talk about this forever. Yeah, we'll talk about it again. Yeah.
Yeah, so we'll talk about practice rounds next time because I think there's a lot there that folks can really get in terms of best practice. And I think over the course of this series, hopefully these are good tips that juniors can take into their season for next year.
Yeah, for sure. Especially as you're planning your 24 season. If you're thinking about all the things that you should be improving on in your skills, like your driving, or your approach, or your putting, or short game, you should be creating at least one for just your mental skills or your preparation skills, and that these things would fit in those buckets.
So this time we're going to talk about the practice round. So generally that's going to be the day before. We can just assume that's going to be the day before for purposes of this discussion. But just like building on everything that we talked about last time, making those notes, getting the yardage book, checking the wind conditions. Now it's the day of. Like you're closer to the real course tournament conditions. You're there on site. But what have you seen as like the best practices in this space, and maybe things that junior golfers should be picking up on that they might not be picking up on?
Yeah, if you think about whenever a kid wins at his home course, everyone always say, well, it's just his home course, so that's why he won. Which all that means is that there's a huge advantage if you know the golf course really, really well. So much so that players will be like, well, he's not even that good. He just won because it's his home course. So I always approach it as a practice round. You're just trying to make the golf course like your home course to where you feel like you have an advantage. And so what makes someone's home course easier to them? It starts with they have a lot of conviction about what to hit off the tee. Like they almost never make a bad decision. So if you did the stuff that we talked about last time, as far as like doing Google Earth and going through your yardage book, you should be showing up to your practice round, having a really good idea of what you're going to hit. And now the day of is all about affirming what you're going to hit. Sometimes we get to the course and some of the tee shots may make us uncomfortable, or we realize the fairways are firmer or the fairways are softer and I can hit driver. So it's really coming up with, based on the wind conditions, what am I going to hit off the tee? And making note of those in your yardage book. From there, I would be making yardage buckets. So if, let's say I'm 160 yards out on my approach shots, I'd be making little notes of like 25 yardage buckets of how many shots I have from 100 to 125, 126 to 150, 151 to 175. That way in my warm-up or in a post-round, practice round, I can kind of go isolate those yardages that seem to be really, really important. As you're playing, let's say you hit the middle of every fairway. It's probably a good idea to be throwing some balls in the rough, like really, really trying to understand the condition of the golf course. That's usually the main thing that messes kids up, is like the golf course grass or the firmness or the softness is just so much different than they're used to, including the fairways. Now, those two things are fairly easy, like tee shot strategy and then what approach shots you're going to have in. The real like meat of the practice round is spending a lot of time on and around the greens, because that's where most of the time it just gets questionable, just because maybe when you're chipping, it spins a little bit different, or the greens are really fast, or the rough is really bad, or the bunker is a little bit different. And so spending a majority of your time on and around the greens is important. I'm not a huge proponent of like spending a ton of time like putting to, the holes where they're dotted. I mean, if you're going to get the pin sheets the night of the event, so you're going to be able to dot the pins and look at your yardage book and potentially look at, how much slope a hole has. I would be spending more time just in general getting used to hitting chip shots to different parts of the green. If you want to hit them to those hole locations, that's great. Getting used to speed control, getting used to seeing the proper lines based on the speed you're going to have. Just feeling comfortable with the speed is probably more important than like hitting a few 6-footers to like that whole location where the pin's going to be. Because without a doubt, when a kid plays a new course, their speed control is usually off like the first 9 holes, just because it's very, very different. Hitting tons of bunker shots is another thing that I like to do. Depending on the event you're playing, I mean, we play some places that aren't necessarily like the nicest places in the world. And sometimes you'll have some bunkers that are like less than desirable to be in at certain points. So I like to check almost all the bunkers, like take a look, go look at all of them and just understand like, what, this is probably one that I should avoid. Or if I should just be trying to avoid these at all costs. I mean, I remember an event last year, there was no sand. They were literally hitting out of rock. And so we told our players like, listen, these are like hazards. Do not go anywhere near them because they're so penal. So tee shot strategy, approach buckets, and then tons and tons of time around the greens is generally my formula.
So in that example you just mentioned with the bunkers, or even around the green, are you having the juniors like just put a giant like X in the yardage book, like around that bunker, or like where to miss, or like where in the green is like the easiest place to miss if they were to miss?
Yeah, if something's blatant in the practice round, sure. I would say a lot of that would happen like the night that they're preparing. So for example, when my son and I sit down and we do our prep for the next day, we'll go over the whole locations. We'll dot the pins in the yardage book, and then we'll talk about relative to that pin. Where is the best spot to miss? Where's the worst spot to miss? So it's not necessarily always done like during the practice round. Again, practice rounds can be they can be very like time sensitive. So sometimes it's hard to catch everything. But if you have a good yardage book and you've played and you know where the pin is, because sometimes the pins are also not dotted. If they are, that is nice, but it's not necessary. I would say that can be done when you have time to just sit down and reflect on the round and look at your yardage book and look at the whole location sheet. But yes, you should be putting something. Having those reminders is vital, because in the heat of the battle, in the heat of the moment, when you're making decisions, it's easy to forget that stuff. And sometimes if you've only played a course once, maybe you don't remember that the back of the green or over the green or that bunker was terrible. So making those notes at some point before you tee off would be, yes, very important.
And you mentioned speed control on the greens. There's one thing that maybe I have observed, and I haven't been as nearly many tournaments as you have, and I don't know if this is commonplace or not. I've tend to notice that like the green speeds day one of the tournament are usually at least a tick faster than they are in the practice round. Is that commonplace? And like, should junior golfers be factoring that in their prep?
I'll say two things about green speeds practice round to day of. Yes, they usually are a little faster if it's like an elevated event. If it's like a local 2-day event, I haven't seen that necessarily, but I think as you go play some of the events, like Luke's been playing these national things, they're definitely going to speed them up, probably just to cause some havoc for the players. The one thing I hear is a lot is like the practice screen's like way different than the course. And I always say, it's not like they have like a specific mower for the practice screen. I mean, they're mowing the greens with the same mower everywhere. So I don't necessarily see that. I see people struggle with the transition from the practice screen to the course, because a lot of practice screens either have no slope or they have too much slope. So they're really not getting a fair assessment of the greens. That's why I say it's so important the practice round to do a lot of speed control work, because the practice screen isn't necessarily a lot like the greens on the golf course. Not the grass. The grass is the same. The slopes are not necessarily the same.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yes.
So we mentioned yardage book. We got to put a plug in for our friends at Stracka. StrackaLine yardage books are supporting the Driven Golf podcast and the Angle of Attack. They're offering 20% off if you go to their website for their yardage books and their greens books, which have a ton of great detail. I honestly think like you shouldn't go into a tournament without StrackaLine.
100% agree.
If you enter code DRIVEN in the cart, you get 20% off of your purchase. So definitely take advantage of that.
So yeah, StrackaLine, that's our go-to as well. An interesting note, and something that might be a little bit controversial with some kids, is when I have Cameron play practice rounds, I have him keep score. I started doing that in the beginning of this year. One was because I wanted him holing out putts. It's so interesting. I watch kids do practice rounds and they never make a putt, which then seems like they struggle with their holing speed on like 3 to 10 foot putts. So that was one piece. But then two, I felt like it gave some color to him of like what he is likely going to shoot, or like what holes may be giving him the most trouble, so that we can adjust our strategy versus having never played a golf course. I think if you think about this idea of your home course and this idea of a lot of people don't want you to keep score. Well, you keep score on your home course all the time. And it's frequent when a kid goes and plays their home course, they'll play really, really well. So like keeping score in a practice round should have no effect on your expectation heading into it. So it may be it is one of those things that's kind of unique to what I generally tell players. But if you haven't done that, I would encourage you at some point to maybe try keeping score in a practice round to see if it kind of gives you a little bit of confidence heading into the event. And if you don't play well, then it should be like a wake-up call, like, hey, I need to go fix this stuff after the round, versus it's hard to tell how you're playing heading into an event if you just don't keep score, especially at the event you're going to play. So that's my 2 cents I wanted to throw out there for practice rounds.
You hit on one key thing. I mean, sometimes you can't necessarily pick the times they might have a shotgun start in the afternoon, but I think leaving yourself time to digest and maybe practice on something on the range after the round, if you can pick something earlier enough where you can finish the round and still have some time to do that or get on the putting green as needed.
Yeah, for sure.
So last time we talked about just tournament prep being a performance differentiating factor, or maybe being the difference between winning or losing, or getting into a future event or not getting into a future event, like it being that important. Like, have you seen case studies where like this type of practice round prep has been a differentiating factor, maybe for Cameron or in other juniors that you've been working with?
Yeah, for sure. I think, again, practice rounds themselves, like just playing the golf course, I don't think is a differentiator. But when you show up and you have a plan of like how you're going to spend your time, I mean, I can't stress enough, like really, really understanding your short game shots at a new facility is probably the biggest one. That and the speed control, like getting in bunkers, hitting the shots necessary, feeling comfortable hitting those shots it has to be worth a shot or two a round. And if you do that over 2 or 3 days, yeah, you're talking 4 to 6 shots. I have definitely seen that when I have gone to practice round with kids, because it's really easy to just go and play around. And unless you hit it in a bunker, I'm not going to be hitting it in a bunker, or I'm not going to be hitting extra chip shots. I'm not going to be understanding the rough. So yes, having a plan besides just I'm going to go do a practice round is definitely going to help you shoot lower scores.
Yeah, that's interesting. Often like a caddy would probably serve a lot of this as like a sounding board, checking these things out during a tournament, making these observations and pointing things out. But junior golfers generally don't have that luxury, right? They have to really be their own caddy. So like, again, it makes it that much more important to be a differentiating factor between you and the field. If you have this mindfulness and this conviction to really go all in, and really, you kind of have to serve as your own caddy in many ways.
Yeah, don't get me started on the idea that a junior does not get a caddy. That is one of probably my biggest beefs with junior golf. But yeah, I mean, definitely. The nice thing about doing the prep and having these conversations is that is your time to have these conversations with your coach or with your dad if they're educated, or just even with yourself, like understanding things before versus making like in the moment decisions. Most of the time, a junior, especially if they're not playing very good, like making those in the moment decisions, they just aren't thinking very clearly. They probably have levels of cortisol going through them to where they're just not going to make a logical decision. So hopefully the prep is increasing the likelihood of you having a logical decision made when you're in that moment. That is not black and white. During a round of golf, tee shots are very black and white most of the time. Approach shots become a little bit more gray, but wedges and in is where it becomes very, very gray, because you do have a lot of options, especially if you're a good player. So hopefully we have some logic before we've showed up to the golf course to make those easier to make.
One last thing, I observed Cameron. I was there on hand when he had his first, I think, 36-hole win earlier this year. And I remember you making comments around specific prep for specific pin positions leading up to the event. And I remember just thinking to myself, like, that seemed to be above and beyond what most kids are doing, at least from my perspective. Have you seen, based on his success or other juniors that you work closely with in this aspect, like, where you absolutely know that shot or that hole, what they were able to do and the score they were able to produce was a direct result of the prep that went into it?
Yeah, probably not as much with the kids that I coach, because I'm not with them pre-round very often. But I can speak to specifically, I think, the shot that I know you're talking about. So yeah, with Cameron, Cameron's a very, very short hitter. Relative to his peers. So, we've always said like strategy is going to be the way that he wins. Short game putting and good strategy. So there was a hole on the front 9 of the course. He teed off on the back. There was a hole on the front where we had said like maybe the pin was like 15 on and there was a bunker at 10 on. So he had to for sure cover 10. So we said landed 3 short of the pin and 3 left of the pin. We were anticipating he was hitting an 8 iron into the green. And so we're staying there and I'm telling you like, okay, he's supposed to hit this, basically 9 feet short left. And sure enough, he hits it 9 feet short left. It was like, well, that's what he was supposed to do. And so it just gave a lot of clarity to where he wasn't necessarily having to think. He lasers the flag and goes, okay, I'm trying to hit this 3 yards short, 3 yards left, cover the bunker, even if I maybe push it a little bit. And he ended up making birdie. And it was just like this, like proud moment of like, that's exactly how this is supposed to go. And so our habit is, we get the pin sheets, we look at the weather, we dot where the pins are, and we print out the pin sheet and we write down relative to the flag, like where we're anticipating we want to land it based on the wind condition, what we anticipate he has in for a club. Does that mean that that's always how that goes? No. Maybe the wind switches or maybe the greens are a little bit different, but I mean, having that plan has sure helped his ability to score and frankly beat some people he probably shouldn't, just because he's hitting like 4 woods into greens when they're hitting like 9 irons.
Yeah, and I think the most important thing around that is just having a baseline, and you can adjust from the baseline. But if you don't have a starting point, you're trying to guess and you're hoping that you guess right. But if you have a baseline and you can adjust because maybe it's 10 degrees colder than what you thought it was going to be, or the wind's coming in a different direction, you can make those adjustments on the fly.
A lot of people don't know stuff like this, but there are PGA Tour players that get reports daily, basically telling them how to play the golf course based on their shot patterns, based on where the pins are, based on the temperature, based on the wind conditions, basically saying, here's where the pin's going to be, and you should be aiming here with this yardage intent. And it's like, going to the poker table or the blackjack table and having like the perfect strategy heading in. Now, does that mean they're going to execute it perfectly? No, but the theory is it's allowing you not to execute perfectly. That's the whole point, is you're not going to execute perfectly. So when I realized that's what PGA Tour players are getting years ago, I was like, man, I've got to do something to help my son be able to have a similar chance like those guys have. And so that's where that all started.
Yeah, that's a really interesting way to think of it, because if you have a prep gap, right, versus somebody in the field, you have to overcome that with a skill gap, right? And then I think as you get higher and higher and further in this junior golf landscape, the
gaps are small.
The gaps are very, very small. So you have to seek out these other ways to differentiate yourself. And like I said, you may beat guys that are, you're always trying to beat the guys that are ranked ahead of you in a tournament, right? That's the thing that's going to lead you to moving up in the rankings of the head-to-head and scoring relative to the field. So this is something that I think is an absolute must for junior golfers to look into.
That was what was so amazing about, Tiger, is that not only was he better than everybody, but he also clearly had better strategy than everybody. And he had more discipline than everybody. So he was literally impossible to beat most weeks because no one was going to catch him from a skill standpoint. And then he never made an illogical decision for the most part. And the weeks that he didn't necessarily win, he must have just had like his F game, but he still probably finished in the top 10 almost every time, just because his strategy and his prep were just so good heading into it. Better than every other PGA Tour player.
Yeah, for sure.
Which is pretty crazy.
This episode, we're going to talk about very kind of laser focused. This is within the tournament and just being prepared, let's say like night before, morning of, and then post round. What are some of the differentiating factors? Because I think you're looking for that advantage amongst the field. Like, where can you gain an advantage in these 3 areas around just being better prepared and better, more laser focused than the rest of the field?
Yeah, so let's start with the night before the event. This is probably your last opportunity to really prepare for tomorrow's round. And so what does that mean? In my world, that's looking over the pin sheets or the whole location sheets. Most of the time, those are going to be emailed out or listed on the website, and really going through, what your strategy is going to be. Also looking at the weather conditions for tomorrow, looking at the temperature, really just trying to almost visualize or anticipate like the shots you're going to be hitting. I physically would dot my pen, so I'll literally get a pencil and write on the whole location sheet or on the yardage book where the whole location is going to be, just so I can start to kind of understand where that is. Yeah, it's nice to have the whole location sheet in your back pocket with your yardage book, but I think having it dotted makes being able to, if you are going to use the greens data, it makes it that much faster. Other than that, for a night before, I really think you need to think about, what you're eating the night before and like the amount of sleep you're going to have, and really almost like working your way back. So for example, if you have an 8 a.m. tee time, well, then I'm going to have to get up, or I want to be at the golf course at 6:45. That means I need to be up by 6 o'clock or 5:45, and I need 9 hours of sleep. So I'm having to go to bed at 8:45. And so really like planning your night based on like what your tee time is the night before, so that you have adequate amount of sleep, adequate amount of food, adequate amount of water, to where you're showing up feeling like you're ready to go play golf. Versus I've had some kids playing Fortnite till like, 1 o'clock in the morning for a 6 o'clock wake up. They weren't exactly prepared, and they may or may not have had the worst round of their year, so we can avoid those things by just being smart. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
I could tell you, I mean, we've been traveling quite a bit for tournaments, and I wasn't there, but there's one example where my wife and my son, they saw one of their first round playing partners the morning before the final round. And he has said, he said he had been up watching movies till like 3 in the morning, and he shot 81 or, and when you think about like what's at stake for these tournaments, we talked about a few episodes. But between the difference between a high finish and a low finish, there's a lot at stake, and you're going a long way. Sometimes you're spending quite a bit of money, and you want to optimize for this performance. And really, one stroke matters, and definitely being ill prepared or unrested could be the difference between 5 or 6 or even more strokes, and difference between being in the middle of the pack or towards the bottom of the field. Yeah, it's pretty interesting.
Yeah. The reason that I like to do that stuff the night before versus like the morning of, I guess it'd be okay if it was like an afternoon tee time, you could do some of that in the morning, is, your morning routine, for most golfers is like an hour, 15 hour and 30 minutes. Like you don't have a ton of extra time. It takes 15 or 20 minutes to kind of go through your book, dot the pins, think about your strategy. So I would say if you can space some of that out, that's probably going to keep you a little bit fresher mentally. I mean, think of your brain as like a battery, and the more things you're focusing on throughout the day. We're talking, a round of golf from the time you wake up to the time you finish, you're talking like 7 or 8 hours. And it's very, very easy to feel like emotionally and physically drained. So doing some of that the night before should make you feel a little bit more fresh versus like waking up earlier to try to do some of that. I just think that would be like beneficial for most players. Yeah.
And then in my experience, it always takes a little bit longer to get out the door, to get to the course. You underestimate the time it's going to take to get out to the driving range and that sort of thing. And I think the feeling of being rushed in the morning, the day of, and
terrible.
And like that drains your battery faster, and it puts you in a state of mind where you're just not ready to play your best golf from my perspective.
Yeah. So, so let's assume you do all that, show up to the golf course, you're ready to go. I do think it's good to have like almost like a checklist of things that you should be having. We just had an event this last week, and we forgot a couple things. We weren't staying on our house, but it's so easy to forget things that you might need for the event. But let's assume that you have everything. A player's routine is very, very unique. And I'm not going to speak necessarily to like a specific routine. I would say, though, that what I see with a lot of kids in their pre-round is that they just don't touch on enough stuff. For example, they don't hit bunker shots. They don't hit enough shots around the greens. They do very little speed control. And they spend a majority of their time hitting golf balls, like too many golf balls. And so I would say that if you're going to spend a majority of your time, you should be getting used to the conditions more than like making sure that I'm hitting it good. If you're having to make sure that you're hitting it really, really good in your warm up, then that's kind of like that cramming for the test analogy that I've used in previous episodes, to where you're just hoping that it's going to be good enough versus like, hey, I just need to kind of get warmed up for the day. I really don't know like how fast the greens are. I really don't know how that first landing spot chipping is going to react. I don't know what the bunkers are like. And just because you played yesterday doesn't mean you know what the bunkers are like. If it's early in the morning, they're probably wet and they're going to react differently. And so, getting used to the conditions would be more important than like just spending 45 minutes hitting. I have a very specific routine that I like to do, and I'd be happy to discuss if that would be helpful. But come up with yours and make sure it has a lot of touch points.
Yeah, let's talk about like what would your normal prep be?
Yeah, so my first one would be go straight to the green and start doing speed control. When I think about, when I struggle on the greens, it's usually from like 25 to 30 feet. So I'll start, 30, 45, 50 feet and just take 2 or 3 balls and start hitting very, very different types of putts, uphill, downhill, side hill. And the reason I like to have 3 balls is like the first ball is very, very reactionary to like what I'm feeling. And I just hit that putt. And then those next 2 balls are making adjustments based on what I'm seeing. And hopefully I'm starting to see a pattern of like, oh, I'm hitting these way harder or way shorter. I use the line when I putt, but even when I'm doing like this basic warm up with speed control, I'm just getting used to the speed. I'm not necessarily doing anything specific. From there, I take those same 3 balls and I start doing short game stuff. I do lots of chipping from the fairway, from the rough, and from the bunker. I find that for 2 reasons. One is it kind of helps me get loose. I don't have like a very specific like stretching routine like I know a lot of players do. I kind of get more loose just by like hitting little short game shots. The thing there is getting used to not necessarily the grass I'm chipping on or the rough I'm chipping out of. Down here, the grass isn't that different. It's more how is the green reacting? Is it spinning? Is it skidding? Are they firm? Are they slow? And then going through the shots I anticipate I'm going to be hitting. So low draws, mid cuts, flop shots, shots from the rough, different types of bunker shots. That's probably taken me about half an hour to do those 2 things. And then from there is when I'll go hit. And I'm kind of weird. I only hit my like even numbered clubs. And that'll probably take me about 15 or 20 minutes. And then the last thing I do is I go back and I start doing my routine of putting, which is for me is I'm dialing in my aim point reads. And I'm doing a lot of putts from like 4 to 15 feet moving around the green with 1 ball full routine. And the last thing I do is I hit a 4-footer because I want to see a putt go in before I go to the first tee. So that all in all takes me about an hour and 15 minutes. And I've been doing that for the last 15 years or so. And interestingly, I saw something on like Golf Digest or PGA Tour. That's pretty much exactly what Tiger Woods does as far as his routine. And maybe that's why I did it originally, or maybe it was just coincidence, but it helps me make sure that I feel super prepared for like the day.
That's interesting. I was going to ask, honestly, before you mentioned it, whether it's putting green first or driving range first or vice versa, or if it matters, if you had a preference for one or the other.
I mean, I don't like hitting first because I feel like I have like 30 to 45 minutes after I hit to when my tee time is. And I just feel like I kind of like lose my feels a little bit. In my warm up, I probably am hitting my last tee shot with like 20 minutes before my tee time, because that leaves me like 10 minutes to kind of go through my putting. If I were to add any time to my routine, let's say I got there like an hour and a half earlier, I probably would do more like makeable putts in my warm up. Like that, it stretched that out to probably like 15 minutes of just seeing putts go in.
That's interesting. Now, one last thing on pre-round. What about like specific shot, like visualizing specific shots, either the first tee or like the par 3s, like knowing exactly what you're going to need? Would you practice that specifically on the driving range?
It depends on the course or how uncomfortable certain shots made me. You'll hear a lot of guys say that they like their last shot they hit on the range is like the shot they're going to go hit on the first tee. I think there's a lot of value to that. I would usually hit the shots that I'm anticipating hitting off the tee, like a tee down, like low cut versus like a high draw. I definitely would be going through those, not necessarily thinking specifically about a hole, but just more like I know I'm going to be hitting those 2 or 3 shots because I kind of hit those shots every round. I would be going back to something we talked about last time. If there's like specific yardage buckets that are very, very important, I probably would be spending a little bit more time on those yardage buckets. More than just hitting like 6 balls with my pitching wedge and 6 balls with my 8-iron. Maybe I'll spend more time on my 6-iron because I know I'm going to have a bunch of those. But not necessarily like specific to like a shot shape. Now, with that said, if I knew it was going to be very, very windy, then I'm definitely doing a lot more like low punch draws, low punch fades, just getting used to something that's abnormal because you're going to have to be flighting the ball in conditions like that. Or if the ground's really, really wet, making sure that I'm moving my low point forward, doing some things just to make sure I'm not going to hit any shots like fat or hit the ground early. But no, I wouldn't say that my pre-round routine, it's more of a routine. It's not necessarily like specific to the course.
Okay.
As much.
Okay. One last thing before we wrap up, just around like post round, just real quickly, like anything in terms of digesting what just happened, and that's going to help you in the later rounds.
Yeah, I think the reflection piece. I'd see the reflection piece in two areas. One, you have your like immediately after your round, like, are you going to do any post round practice based on how you just played? And that would be really like skill specific. Like, I saw my speed control today was terrible, or I noticed I kept having like a certain type of shot show up, like a high right, and I need to go solve that. I think it's important to go solve those things because, again, if you're just hoping it's going to be better tomorrow, the likelihood of that going away is very, very low. And so trying to find a solution would be good. Most likely, if you really were paying attention heading into the event, you probably were seeing that same shot. You just may have been ignoring it. So it's probably a very common solution. So it shouldn't like be that you need, hours on the driving range. I remember, when Bryson won the US Open, right? He's the last one on the range and he's trying to hit this like certain drive. I mean, he's winning the US Open, but he's still like on the driving range working on a certain type of shot because it just wasn't going exactly how he wanted. So, I think all the prep in the world, you're still probably going to need a little post-round practice. Now, specific to like your reflection, I do think it's very, very important to be doing your statistics, even if you don't want to, or even if you're tired, like making sure that that's fresh and put in. Just because over time you're going to forget a lot of detail. Hopefully you're writing all that stuff down, but even when you enter your stats, there's probably some stuff that you're just having to remember. It's hard to write everything down on your scorecard. And then, you're kind of starting the cycle over again, right? Like you're doing your reflection and then I'm dotting my pins again for day 2. And so now you're kind of circling back into like my prep for the next day. So that statistics piece kind of like wraps up day 1. And now I can start focusing on day 2.
Yeah, that's interesting. And get Chipotle.
And get Chipotle. Yes. The last thing I'll say about this is like everyone is a little bit different. Like how I have my routine, not everyone does things the way I do. Again, I think golf is very much about conviction. Like you just have to develop a lot of conviction around what you do. And if you believe in it and it's working for you, that's great. If it's not, then like be open to changing those things. The reason that I have a lot of conviction is it's really, really worked for me in my playing career. And so like, it'd be really hard to get someone to change like how I do things, like heading into events or like at the event. And if you're not in that boat, that's fine. Like be open to maybe some of the stuff that I'm telling you. Maybe that'll be helpful.
Yeah, I think it's find your path, but be convicted to that path. And I just think like the conviction and the confidence that is a result of the conviction can only lead to improved play, lower scores, and better tournament finishes. And that's what we're all striving for, right?
Yeah.
At the end of the day.
Yeah, like you've asked me, about, should Luke has a TrackMan, right? So should Luke use TrackMan in his warm up? It's like, oh, you know what? There are players that do that. There are other players that don't. Like that's him trying to figure out like, is this a helpful thing for me to do in my warm up, or is that something that I should do post round? Like that's something that he's kind of like figuring out right now. Like that's kind of what I mean about like the conviction of like what makes you feel most ready. And that's fine. Like you don't have to have that all figured out right now, but just be processing that, just like you're reflecting on your stats, reflect on like all this other stuff too.
The Driven Golf Podcast is produced by Joseph K. If you like this episode, like it, subscribe, pass it on to a friend who might be interested. It really helps us out a lot. We'll be back in a couple weeks with the next episode. Until then, remember, in this great game, the journey is the gift. Enjoy the journey.
Start starting junior golf. Wondering, how can I do this? Just listen to Jimmy C and my man Andrew Lewis. The purest for the purest and all those who pursue this. I knew that you need this. Andrew Lewis is the true Ayo. Hey, made way, it's that Ayo way. Making waves all day with producer Joseph K. The tools for getting better each and every day. Knowledge on display, we got the full array. Ayo, drop the beat, it's time to unpack. We're driven, moving forward, never looking back. Jimmy C and Andrew Lewis, no time to relax. Collecting facts, dropping stats, it's the angle of attack. What creates the separation from stats attack to turning preparation? Don't be obtuse, get in the conversation. Driven Golf Nation, here's your AOA compilation. You didn't know? Yo, here's your education. For junior golfers, form a firm foundation. Jimmy C and Andrew Lewis, a dream combination. Driven Golf Nation, here's your AOA compilation. Hey yo, drop the beat, it's time to unpack. We're driven, moving forward, no looking back. Jimmy C and Andrew, no time to relax. Collecting facts, dropping stats, it's the angle of attack. Moving forward, no looking back. Collecting facts, dropping stats, it's the angle of attack. Driven, moving forward, no looking back. It's the angle of attack.